Let's talk about some tips for finding the information that you need. First and foremost, when you start researching, you probably want to create a research log. And this is basically a list of all of the places that you have visited while you've been researching so that you can keep track of where you found your information. This makes it a lot easier for you to cite your sources later on, and it also stops you from that last-minute panic of, oh my gosh, I have this one last thing that I need to insert and I know I read it somewhere. Where was it? If you have it in your research log, you'll easily be able to go back and find where that information was so that you don't have to start from scratch and try and find it all over again. So it's like a step-by-step version of what you've been doing. And there's actually a resource that I have found online that I'm going to be linking to in the module this week so that you can learn how to, it's basically an automatic research log. It's really, really cool. When you are researching, you want to start with background information, particularly if you don't have a very strong foundation in the area of your topic to begin with. Starting with the background information makes it a lot easier to comprehend what it is that you are going to be reading later on in your research process as things get a little bit more complex. Those lower level sources are really great for background information. Things like encyclopedias and books and general knowledge websites are really good places to start so that you can learn like the basic vocabulary and stuff like that. In addition, you want to use your library's computers, or rather use the library's website so that you can access all of the databases from your own home computer by logging in with your school ID. Like I said earlier, this gives you access to a lot of sources that you wouldn't think about otherwise. It gives you sources, or it gives you access to academic sources, it gives you access to newspaper resources. It gives you access to the list of books that the library owns. It just has a lot of really good and useful information that you can use for your speeches. You also want to learn how to skim all of the information that you're reading. Now, that's not something that you generally hear from a teacher, is that you should skim the things that you're reading. But in this case, if you try to read every single word of every single article that you come across during your research, your project is never going to get done. So you have to learn to skim each article to see whether or not it's going to be useful to you. So things like looking at the article's title, looking at the subtitles, looking at the words that are italicized or bolded or otherwise emphasized, looking at the beginning of the article as well as the end of it. Each of these skills can help you to determine whether you actually can use the information in that article so that then you can go back and fully read it so that you can cite it properly. Another tip is to read the reference pages of the sources that you are using. For example, if you are on an academic article, they have likely cited a ton of other academic articles that relate to your topic. So you can go to the reference page, find other resources, read those, and cite them yourself. It's really important that you actually read the sources that you are citing, rather than just pulling someone else's references because you need a fourth one. Because it could be that that author messed up somewhere and misquoted or otherwise misrepresented what was in the original source. It's really important that you always go back to that original source to see what that author said so that you can then put it into your own words. But the reference pages of many different resources are really good ways to find even more information about your topic. In addition, we live in a day and age where we have to evaluate the sources that we are looking at. And there's a number of different ways that we can do this. We can look at the date that something was published. We can look at who wrote it. We can look at who published the information. We can assess whether it's an academic resource, and we can look at whether or not it's cited by other authors. So first, we have to look at the date and determine how recently this information was published. Because if it's too old, it might be outdated. It might be irrelevant now. Generally speaking, we go with 5 to 10 years as the range of acceptable dates, so it has to be published within the last 5 to 10 years. However, that changes depending on the topic. right? If you are talking about something that is particularly high-paced and that's changing all the time, you have to cite stuff within the last couple of years, if not the last year. For example, if you're doing something surrounding technology or medicine or even politics, you have to cite things within the last year because things are changing all the time. In addition, you have to ask yourself who the author is of this source and what is their expertise. Is it just Joe Schmo from the New York Times, or is it some kind of expert within the field? Usually, you can take the name of the author and pop that into Google and see what their credentials are. So I highly encourage you to do that when you're evaluating your sources, especially if you're pulling them from online. In addition, you have to ask yourself, who is it that's publishing this information, and do they have any reason to publish this specific information? For example, a lot of times, articles are paid for by companies to promote their product. For example, if you go on BuzzFeed, and if you look at some of their listicles, they are paid for by companies to promote their products. So an article with 9 hot tips for your spring cleaning phase is sponsored by Swiffer. And 23 things you need to know before owning a home is sponsored by Rocket Mortgage. So you have to ask yourself if there was any money involved in the publishing of this article, and there probably was, and where that money came from. Why is this information being made public? And can we trust the information that's being made public? There have actually been instances where even academic sources have been paid for by companies that wanted specific information to get out and specific information to not get out. For example, there have been studies done about big tobacco, about the harmful effects of tobacco, that have been paid for by big tobacco companies. And therefore, the report was that it's not that bad, right? Tobacco's not that bad for your health, it's fine. So you have to ask yourself where the money came from. Now, in general, academic sources are going to be preferable to non-academic sources because, as I said earlier, it's often checked by a number of different people before it ever gets published. Whereas something that you find online, it could just be someone publishing whatever the heck they want online, and there's no one checking that. Academic sources have a number of different people who are experts in the field checking to make sure that the information is correct. Finally, you can ask yourself whether or not this information is being cited by other people. If an article is cited multiple times by a lot of different resources, then you know that it's probably a good article because it's been cited in that area, right? It's being talked about very frequently. If something isn't being cited as frequently, you might want to take another look at it and make sure that it's actually legitimate and correct. Because oftentimes if it's not being talked about by other people, that's because it's not really true, or it's not the best information that exists. And we always want the best information that exists for our speeches.